the first benefit of improving self-awareness, and perhaps for some of you the most important, is this is the fastest way to improve your impact on the P&L. And here's why. I'd like you to reflect on any time you've seen a senior leader make a poor decision that had a really negative impact on gross margins or expenses, or just in general. Or maybe even a decision that you've made, if you're okay reflecting on that. And I think what you'll find is that it's almost never a result of lack of knowledge. It's not that people don't know. It's not that, think of yourselves. You know your industry, right? You know your organization. You know your role in that organization. It's not a lack of knowledge that results in a poor decision. In almost every case, what's resulting, the cause of a poor decision, is this tricky little psychological phenomenon known as a cognitive bias. So a cognitive bias is something that's ingrained into us throughout our lives that causes an otherwise rational person to make an either irrational or suboptimal decision. And oftentimes, these cognitive biases are completely unconscious. We're not even aware that we have them. So we're continuing to make a decision over and over again, or a type of decision that's having a negative impact on either gross margins or expenses, or even there's cognitive biases that affect your personal lives as well, without even realizing it. And even if we are aware, it's still pretty tricky to be free from them, which we'll talk about in a minute. So to give you an example of, well, before I give you an example, have any of you heard of this term before, cognitive bias? I see many heads, yes, okay. So this was actually first, I'm sure it was discovered before this, but it was really first researched in depth in the 70s by a man named Amos Tversky and his colleague, who I'm sure most of you have heard of, Daniel Kahneman. They actually won a Nobel Prize for this discovery as it relates, and they created a whole new field around this area called behavioral economics. So here's an example of one. I'm sure you can all relate to this to some degree, unless you're like me and you don't watch television or anything like that. But let's say you're like this fellow here, and it's a Saturday, and you're binge watching your favorite Netflix series, whatever that is for you, okay? Or you just think of something similar to that. And let's say it's 12 hours worth of videos that you need to watch, and you're 9 hours in, and then it dawns on you, you know, I should probably go do something more productive, like spend time with my family, or get some work done, or go to the gym. But then you tell yourself, but if I quit now, those first 9 hours will be a total waste. I gotta finish, right? I'm not a quitter. Is that rational? No, that's totally irrational, but you're never gonna get those first 9 hours back, no matter what you do. So the moment that you realize that a better course of action would be to do something different, the rational decision is to stop right there and do whatever you've determined is a better course of action. This is a cognitive bias called the sunk cost bias. And although this is kind of a silly example, and I'm sure many of us can relate to this in some area of our lives, this is happening in organizations every single day. People are continuing to go down a course of action, not because it's the best course of action, but because they've already invested so much time and money. And that is irrational, but this catches people all the time. Now the good news is, there's a couple pieces of good news here for you. One is that cognitive biases are easily assessed. In fact, this is something when we do in-depth training and coaching programs with leaders, this is one of the first things that we do, is we have the research that I mentioned comes from the Perth Leadership Institute they were doing alongside Daniel Kahneman about the same time. And what they've discovered at the Perth Leadership Institute is there are quite a few cognitive biases that correlate very, very tightly to a leader's impact on gross margins and expenses. And so that's the first thing that we do, is assess people and figure out, all right, well, what type of impact are you going to make based on how you're conditioned? And then that helps people correct. Unfortunately, some organizations use this to hire and fire leaders, which is not something we recommend, because people can adjust. It's not designed for that. It's designed to help somebody know, hey, here's how you're inclined to make decisions, here's how you're inclined to think, but now knowing this, you're much less likely to fall prey to those cognitive biases. The other piece of good news is that mindfulness training can actually help you to be free from cognitive bias, which is why I'm mentioning it in this course here, this session. So we've known this, practitioners have known this since the beginning of time here with mindfulness training. This is essentially what mindfulness training was designed to do, was to free us from our habitual ways of thinking and deciding and acting, behaving in the world. But we now have some pretty interesting research demonstrating that this is in fact the case. Perhaps the most well-known study is some research that was conducted in conjunction with two MBA programs. One was INSEAD, which is a European MBA program. It's essentially an Ivy League level, it's a world-class MBA program. And they were partnering with Wharton, which is an Ivy League level MBA program. And what the researchers hypothesized was that mindfulness training, because a lot of the effects of cognitive biases result when we're caught up in an emotion and we're thinking a lot about past and future, and one of the side effects of mindfulness is that we're not so caught up in past and future, we're more right here with the present. They hypothesized that mindfulness would help create some freedom from being impacted by cognitive bias. So what they did at first was they took two groups of people who were people who assessed as being kind of trait mindfulness, so they're just generally mindful people, so to speak, versus people who are not so much. And as they hypothesized, the people who are more generally mindful were less likely to be affected by the cognitive bias that they were measuring, which happens to be the sunk cost bias, which is why I used that one as an example. So that got them excited, and then they took it a step further. And they took a randomly selected group of people, divided them in half, and half of the people received just 15 minutes of guided mindfulness training. And the other people were asked to just think through problem solving or something like that, just doing whatever you normally would. The people who received only 15 minutes of mindfulness training were 50%. They were half as likely to be negatively impacted by the sunk cost bias and make a poor decision. So think about this. Imagine you have a team of leaders, you're getting ready to make a decision, and in 15 minutes you can reduce the likelihood of a suboptimal decision by half. Imagine what you could do if you're integrating this training into your daily life, which is what I hope to inspire you to do today.